Welcome, Dr. Bruce. So nice to have you here again today. So last week we concluded the I Deserve It series with I Deserve Condemnation, but He gave me another chance. And this week we started the When God Judges series, and it was part 1. From a Christian perspective, what is God's judgment?
Thank you for that question. You know, when we speak of judgment, obviously from a human perspective, we see that as judging people where we have certain prejudices and we already have some opinion. God doesn't judge like that. God's divine judgment is a righteous judgment, and His judgment is necessary in order to reveal to mankind that He is a God who is just. Part of His characteristic, part of His attributes is in actual fact to be a judge. And God's character demands justice. So God's judgment, divine judgment, indicates that God believes that sin and rebellion needs to be dealt with.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Bruce. Now, listen, how important is it for us to understand that the program of God's grace is not unlimited?
Right. Yes, God's grace. Grace is one of His attributes as well, and it's an eternal attribute, like all the attributes of God. And we know that God's grace is unlimited. However, there is a time and a program for God's grace. When God dealt with the people of Noah's day in that generation, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. The door of grace was actually open for anyone who wanted to enter into the ark. But because they did not accept that gift, they in actual fact were judged. The result was Noah's family was saved because they were in the ark. God's grace, the door of God's grace is actually open to mankind today. But the time will come where God says, enough is enough. I've shown you mercy. I've shown you grace. I've made all the means available to you to come to know me and to be saved from the wrath to come. Now that you reject it, the wrath will come. And that is what is actually going to happen because of the rejection of God's grace. So God's grace doesn't change. It is in actual fact the attitude of man towards what God is offering that will affect them.
You know, when we think about judgment as Christians, we get so scared and we freak out, such that very few of us actually go through the last book of the Bible, which is Revelations, because we're scared of what we might find there. But from a Christian perspective, what does God's judgment mean for us as Christians?
Yeah, I think that when people speak of judgment and refer to God, the final judgment, they think that God is actually going to judge believers with unbelievers. But there are two very, very different terms that are used. You have the Great White Throne Judgment, which is a judgment for unbelievers, and you have the judgment seat of Christ, which is a judgment for believers. So the judgment for believers, called the judgment seat of Christ, is more of an appraisal, where the Lord is going to present rewards. When you deal with the Great White Throne Judgment, which is the Revelation passage you're making reference to, there it is judging all those who are unbelievers and all those who are outside the ambit of God's grace because of their rejection of it.
We are currently living in the age of the program of God's grace. And while we wait for the judgment, what must we keep busy with as Christians?
Well, we have been saved from judgment, and now that we are saved, we are called to serve. And therefore, until the Lord calls us home, we have a responsibility, and our responsibility is to share what we genuinely believe God has performed within our lives and in our souls and in our mind. And therefore, living a righteous life, living a life that honors God is of paramount importance. We are called to serve. We are not called to be masters, we are called to be servants. So if we are going to live out our Christian faith, we need to live it out in a way that brings honor to God's name, so that those who see by our lifestyle, see that we are sincere and genuine about our faith, that will in actual fact attract them to want to know answers to their many questions that every human being has. And they will find those answers by virtue of the fact that we've been a testimony to them. So our responsibility is to live the Christian life in such a way that we bring honor to God's name.
In conclusion, Dr. Bruce, that was just absolutely excellent. Next week is part 2 of When God Judges. What must we expect?
Well, I think next week it's going to be very interesting, because this week we've actually looked at the significance of God's judgment. Next week we're going to be looking at the signs that would indicate the pending judgment of God, how close it is. We're standing at the cusp of many things that are happening globally. There are certain things that are being put together that the Bible has predicted thousands of years ago will occur. And that's what we're going to be dealing with next week. The signs of the times, how certain things are happening in the world today that would indicate to us that the coming of the Lord is near and that judgment is pending.